In this lecture, we are going to prepare the endpoint for the login form. This time, we're going to start with the PHP function for handling the request. After the function is ready, we'll prepare the form on the front end. To get started, open the init.php file. Inside this file, we registered a new route for user registration. The process is going to be the same for the login form. Let's create a new route by calling the register REST route function. The first argument of this function is the namespace. Let's set the namespace to up/v1. We're using the same namespace as before. It's considered good practice to use a consistent namespace for our routes. As long as they're related to one another, it's perfectly fine to share a namespace. Next, let's pass on the path for this route. The name of the route will be called /signin. Afterward, let's pass in an array for configuring the route. First, we should limit the route to post requests. Let's set the methods key to post. Next, set the callback key to the following value, up REST API sign-in handler. Lastly, set the permission callback key to the return true function. After adding these three keys, we can define the function for handling the request. Create a file called signin.php. Inside this file, define the up REST API sign-in handler function. So far, so good. The next step is to handle the response. Inside this function, let's create a variable called response. The value for this variable will be an array. We're going to be using the same practice as before. The array should contain a key called status. The value for this key will be 1. If the response fails, we will leave the status as 1. Otherwise, the status should be updated to 2 for a successful response. Next, let's begin validating the request. If the visitor fails to provide a username or password, we should not authenticate them into the system. Let's update the function to accept the request argument. Afterward, let's grab the data received by the request. Below the response variable, define another variable called parameters. The value for this variable will be the request getJSON params function. The getJSON params function will extract data from the body of the request. The final step is to validate the parameters. Create a conditional statement that returns the response variable. We're going to create 3 conditions. The first condition will be the isSet function with the not operator. The first condition will check the parameters from the body of the request. Inside this function, pass in the params user login and params password variables. Next, let's add the condition with the OR operator. The second condition will be the empty function with the params user login variable. Lastly, let's add the OR operator one more time. The last condition will be the empty function again. This time, we're going to check the params password variable. If any of these conditions are true, the form has invalid data. We should not authenticate the user. Let's assume the values are valid. We can proceed to update the status key of the response variable. The variable should be updated to 2. Lastly, let's return the response. I know I flew by the solution. Most of this isn't new to us. These are steps we've covered in the previous lecture. This was an opportunity to practice creating an endpoint. As you can see, the process is mostly the same. Let's test our endpoint. Open the Postman application. Throughout this course, we are going to be creating additional endpoints. Before we test our new endpoint, let's start organizing our endpoints. Postman has a feature for organizing URLs into collections. A collection can be thought of as a folder for your URLs. Let's store our endpoints into a collection for authentication. On the sidebar, click on the folder icon. This will open the collection for a workspace. Next, let's add a new collection. Postman will open a new tab for the collection. We can edit the name of the collection by pressing the pencil icon. Let's set the name to Authentication. Afterward, switch to the other tab. From a previous session, Postman will save the registration URL. We can click on the Save button to add this URL to the Authentication collection. The URL can be given a name. Let's set the name to Register. After setting the name, let's save the URL. The endpoint should appear in the collection. By saving the URL, we can revisit the URL without typing the URL on new sessions. It'll be easier to revisit endpoints. Next, let's add the endpoint for logging in. Add a new tab. Inside the URL input, add the following URL: wp-json/up/v1/signin. Next, let's change the method to post. Great! We can finally attempt to send the request. As expected, the response will reject the request. We haven't provided the user login or password. Let's add this information to the request by switching to the Body tab. Under this tab, we need to change the body of the request by selecting the Raw option. On the right side, we can specify the content type by setting it to JSON. Lastly, let's create an object with the user login and password properties. Their values can be random. Initiate the request one more time. This time, the request should go through. We can verify the response by checking the status key. The value of this key is 2. Perfect! We've successfully created the endpoint. In the next lecture, let's begin authenticating the user.